This morning, you will hear from Dr. Fatih Birol, our Executive Director, and from Tim Gould, the head of our Energy Supply and Investments and Outlook Division. We also have with us Tae-Yoon Kim, our senior analyst here, who is one of the main authors for this report. We will hear from Dr. Birol and from Tim Gould, and then we will take your questions via the Zoom Q&A box. Please send us your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them. This conference will last about 45 minutes. We'll take a brief break before the questions. Just a reminder that the report is online, fully available for free, as well as the data on our website, ia.org. With that, Dr. Birol, I would like to turn the floor to you. Thank you.
Greetings from International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. Welcome to the launch of this new IA report on the role of critical minerals in clean energy transitions. Now, I would like to start with a question that many of us may have in mind. Why is the IEA, the International Energy Agency, we are an energy agency, devote its time on a topic on the minerals? I think it's a legitimate question. And our answer is, on the other side, very clear, because the critical minerals are essential ingredients of the future clean energy system of the world. Lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, and so-called rare elements. These are the ingredients of our clean energy system we all try to build in the future. Now, when we think of if we try to visualize our future clean energy systems, millions of electric vehicles, cars, buses, windmills, solar panels, hydrogen is becoming a very important part. Those clean energy components do not need fuels like oil or gas or coal. They need, on the other hand, they need minerals to build. And they require a huge amount of minerals. And in this study, we wanted to find out if the world reaches its climate goals, how much critical minerals will be needed one by one, and whether or not the world is ready to meet that demand growth. So from our point of view, the availability and affordability of the critical minerals is critical to reach our clean energy and climate goals. And we think, and our numbers show that, we will tell you in a few seconds, our numbers show that the critical minerals are not a side show in our journey to reach climate goals, but it's a part of the main event. And the affordability and availability of the critical minerals, we think, is a part of energy security of the 21st century. As such, International Energy Agency are a long-standing leadership role in terms of energy security, started with oil, but then gas, then with electricity recently, with the integration of renewables, and now we are in the opinion that the critical minerals should be part of the energy security concept of 21st century. Now, what happens if we do not pay enough attention to critical minerals as governments, as industry, as investors, as citizens? What could happen? Just one of them, the prices of those critical minerals will increase sharply. And this would mean that the clean energy transitions may well be costlier and therefore slower than we would like to see. So it is the reason we are publishing this report today to give a heads up to governments to see how great is the growth of the critical minerals in the next years to come, and they shouldn't only pay attention to providing incentives for the electric cars, for batteries, for windmills, solar panels, but they should also think the other side of the coin, which is affordability and availability of critical minerals. The study we are sharing with you today, and as my colleague just said, it will be free, available in our website, the study, the data, and everything. It is the most comprehensive global study of its kind. And even the database which was developed for this study is very impressive. So for that, I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. Tim Gould, who oversaw this important report, like many important reports of the International Energy Agency, but also my colleague, Mr. Tae-Yoon Kim, who is the lead author of this important study. Now, my colleagues will share with you some of the findings, but I want to just give you a bit of a flavor. If the world is to reach net zero goals by 2050, the demand, overall demand for critical minerals will increase by a factor of 6. And this is the overall demand, a huge increase there. But some of the critical minerals, the growth is even much more impressive. For example, a critical one, a very important one, lithium. Lithium demand, with all the expectations on the batteries, electric cars, and others, lithium demand between today and 2040 will increase by a factor of 75. By a factor of 75, huge increase. Now the question is whether or not this demand growth can be met by the production, but our analysis, the analysis of my colleagues, shows that there is a looming mismatch between the world's climate ambitions and the availability of critical minerals today to realize those ambitions. This mismatch is something that worries us. And another thing that worries us is that some of those critical minerals are concentrated on a very few number of countries. It is not important which countries they are, but the concentration of a very few number of countries may well mean that it could lead to disruptions as a result of the nature events, as a result of other developments. So it is a security issue. And again, coming back to the market conditions, many of us, I guess, observed just an example of of today, the copper prices now are over $10,000 per ton. It was very, copper prices were rather stable when you look at the last decade, about $7,000 per ton, a big jump. And copper is the main ingredient of our hopes for the electrification of our energy systems. And my colleagues calculated that this difference in the price of copper, I mentioned, to $7,000 to $10,000, could add about $500 billion to the cost of transition over the next 2 decades, an additional $500 billion. So which means, again, making it costlier, reaching our climate goals, and therefore more difficult. But once again, the world has enough capital, enough deposits of the critical minerals, but whether or not this money will meet the deposits and the production of this critical minerals grow is a big question mark. And one of the key issues here, I believe, that the investors have not been yet convinced by the government's pledges to reduce the emissions, and if they get from the governments unmistakable signals that the clean energy technologies are the technologies of tomorrow, then I believe this investment will flow those deposits, and we will see those critical minerals production to grow. Finally, dear colleagues, seeing this critical minerals issue and the very fact that the global energy system in the future will build on these critical minerals, looking at the challenges on the affordability side, investment side, security side, International Energy Agency, at the end of this report, came up with 6 key recommendations to policymakers around the world, which we are going to share and discuss with all member governments of the International Energy Agency family, all 38 members of the International Energy family, and the other governments and other stakeholders in the next days and weeks to come. With this, I would like to thank once again my colleagues, Mr. Tim Gould, Mr. Taeyun Kim, and the entire team for coming up with such a groundbreaking report. Over to you, Mr. Gould.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. And I'd like to start by echoing your thanks to Taeyun and to the great team from across the agency that put together this analysis. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to run through some of the key findings before we have the chance to take your questions. And perhaps to start with a reminder of where we are over the last year, a proliferation of pledges to reach net zero emissions by mid-century or shortly thereafter. More than 40 countries and the European Union have now committed to this goal, and these countries represent some 70% of global GDP and today's emissions. Of course, pledges are only the start of that journey, but if these are followed up, this implies a massive acceleration in clean energy deployment. And this means a lot more electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, electricity transmission and distribution lines, all essential to move us towards a more sustainable system and to avoid severe impacts from a changing climate. But in turn, that means a lot more of the minerals and metals that go into these technologies. And that's lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, all essential for battery performance, longevity, and energy density. the rare earth elements that go into permanent magnets that are vital for wind turbines and electric vehicle motors. Solar panels, they are not particularly mineral intensive in themselves, but the sheer size of deployment that we would need to meet climate goals means plenty of additional demand for silicon, silver, and copper. And let's not forget the infrastructure of a cleaner and more electrified energy system. Copper is a cornerstone of all electricity-related technologies, and the expansion of electricity grids needs a huge amount of copper and aluminium. So many of the technologies that we need require significantly more minerals than their fossil fuel-based counterparts. We're not considering steel in this analysis or aluminium outside of electricity networks, but it remains striking to see the changes in mineral use implied by energy transitions. A typical electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional vehicle. And an offshore wind plant requires 13 times more mineral resources than a similarly sized gas-fired power plant. And over the last 10 years, as renewables have started to dominate investment in new sources of power generation, the average amount of minerals needed for an additional unit of power generation capacity has increased by 50%. And as the executive director mentioned, the world has more than enough resources to make energy transitions work. But that is not a guarantee that supplies of all these metals and minerals will be available when and where we need them at an affordable price. So a key message from this analysis is, whatever your perspective on the energy sector or on energy transitions, pay attention to critical minerals. They're becoming an increasingly important part of the global conversation on energy and on the transformation of the energy sector and on energy security. The challenges that they pose in energy transitions are manageable, but they do require early attention from policymakers to make sure that transitions can be secure, sustainable, and rapid. So the first question that we needed to answer with this analysis was, how fast could demand for these minerals rise? So we conducted a detailed evaluation of different scenarios and 11 different technology evolution pathways. And the short answer is that a concerted effort to reach global climate goals will require at least a quadrupling of overall mineral requirements for clean energy technologies by 2040. That's the outcome in our sustainable development scenario, a scenario consistent with the Paris Agreement. An even faster transition to hit net zero globally by 2050 would require 6 times more mineral inputs in 2040 than today. And the main factor behind this increase is explosive growth in demand for EVs and battery storage, closely followed by the mineral needs for expanding electricity networks, and then the growth of low carbon power generation. And when you start to look into the details, you see that for some minerals, growth is much faster than the 4 to 6 times you see on the left-hand side of the screen. So in a climate-driven scenario, demand for lithium in particular sees very rapid growth. Now it varies depending on the precise strength of climate policies and the technology pathway. But in a scenario compatible with Paris, demand for lithium is more than 40 times higher than today by 2040. And as the executive director pointed out, if we go for full net zero by 2050, then that amount would increase still further to more than 70 times. There are 2 very important consequences of this demand picture. First, it means that the energy sector is becoming a very major source of demand for these minerals, which hasn't traditionally been the case. Take lithium, for example, on the left-hand side of the screen now. 10 years ago, demand for lithium for energy-related applications was minimal. Already today, EVs and battery storage have displaced consumer electronics to become the largest consumer of lithium. And if we get onto a trajectory consistent with the Paris Agreement, then by 2040, 90% of lithium supply would need to go to the energy sector. The upward trend For other minerals, it's not quite as dramatic as in the case of lithium, but show rises nonetheless. And the second implication relates to the cost structure of producing the clean energy technologies themselves. I think we're all aware that technology learning and economies of scale are bringing down the costs of some key technologies quite dramatically. But as this happens, this also means that raw material costs now account for a larger share of the total. Batteries are a good example. Well, they're much cheaper than they were 5 years ago, but raw materials now account for 50 to 70% of total battery costs, up considerably from where they were. And as a result, higher or more volatile prices for these raw materials could have a significant effect on the costs of transforming our energy system. What does all this mean for mining companies looking to supply the energy sector? Here, the implications are pretty dramatic as well. Today, for example, revenue from coal production is 10 times larger than revenue from energy transition minerals. But there's a rapid reversal of fortunes in a scenario that meets climate goals. As coal goes into structural decline and these energy transition minerals gain a tailwind from growing demand and upward pressure on prices. So combined revenue from energy transition minerals overtakes those from coal well before 2040. And this highlights a strategic opportunity for companies, which some are already taking, to position themselves in growing sectors at the expense of declining ones. This doesn't, though, mean a smooth transition for employment in these sectors. I mean, there are countries like South Africa and Australia with significant resources of coal and critical minerals, but that's not always the case. So there's still a huge task ahead to manage the social implications of change in the energy sector. Turning in more detail to the supply side of the equation. Each supply chain has its own specificities and complexities, but an essential point is that the production of many energy transition minerals is more concentrated than that of oil or natural gas. And that high level of concentration, compounded by complex supply chains in some cases, increases the risks that could arise from physical disruption, trade restrictions, or other developments in major producing countries. So as you can see on the screen, for lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, the world's top 3 producing nations control well over 3/4 of global output. And in some cases, a single country is responsible for around half of worldwide production. So the Democratic Republic of Congo accounts for 70% of global cobalt production. China is responsible for some 60% of global production of rare earth elements. And when it comes to processing and refining operations, the level of concentration is even more notable, with China the decisive player in many of these areas. But China has invested heavily in these mineral supply chains to support the growth of its battery industry, the manufacture of wind turbines and solar panels, and the expansion of its grid. And that leads us to the key question: but if mineral demand picks up quickly, as it will do if today's climate pledges get turned into climate action, will supply be in a position to respond? Now, we've looked closely at today's production capacity and the new projects under construction, and you can see the results on the screen. And in essence, as things stand, the production outlook is geared towards a world of gradual, insufficient action on climate change. Or to echo the words of our executive director, investors and suppliers for the moment do not appear to be convinced that the world's policymakers are going to turn their ambitious targets into action. And that's why we see a looming mismatch between the world's strengthened climate ambitions and the supply of the critical minerals that are essential to realize those ambitions. Now, that mismatch isn't uniform across the board. Some minerals are expected to be in surplus in the near term, while the balance for others, such as lithium, chemical products, battery-grade nickel, and key rare earth elements, looks tighter. However, if we look out towards the end of this decade, notably for the two on the right-hand side of the screen, so lithium and cobalt, expected supply from existing mines and projects under construction meets only half of projected requirements by 2030. Now, one key precondition to narrow this gap is for policymakers to make clear not just their long-term goals, but to fill in the detail on how they plan to get there. And that means clear milestones for action and for near-term clean energy deployment. This will be vital to reduce investment risks and encourage capital to flow to new projects. But there are other supply side factors that we need to have in mind as well. New projects typically have quite significant lead times, including 4 to 5 years on average for construction, as well as additional time for project preparation and permitting. And those long lead times would need to shorten considerably if we are to see a quick and prolonged ramp up in supply. Another issue on the supply side is not about the quantity of resources, but the quality. So some of the highest quality resources are depleting. An example is in Chile, the average copper ore grade in Chile has declined by 30% over the last 15 years. And lower quality ores require more energy to produce, putting upward pressure on production costs, emissions, and waste volumes. So the ability of supply to keep pace with an acceleration in energy transitions should not be taken for granted. As we put together this work, another question that we heard regularly was this one: how clean are clean technologies in reality once you account for emissions along the mineral supply chains? And to answer that question, we compared the choice today between buying a mid-sized conventional gasoline-fueled car versus a battery electric car, looking at the life cycle emissions in each case. What you're looking at on the screen now are the life cycle emissions associated with a gasoline-fueled car. You'll see there's emissions associated with the manufacturing process, but the majority of those life cycle emissions come from the fuel that's used and combusted during the car's lifetime. Now, battery electric vehicle. The manufacturing process is associated with slightly higher emissions, largely due to the battery. But even if you assume the high end of emissions from these processes, the difference with a conventional car is not huge. So the life cycle calculation effectively comes down to the electricity used to power the vehicle. And in a world that takes climate change seriously, the global average electricity mix would result in roughly half the life cycle emissions of a conventional car. And if we recalculate for countries with the cleanest electricity mix, those life cycle emissions halve again. So emissions along the mineral supply chain do not negate the climate advantages of clean energy technologies. That said, mineral producers still have to do more to minimize the emissions that do occur. As part of our research for this report, we found a large variation in emissions footprints of different producers of energy transition minerals, highlighting that there are many opportunities for producers to improve their environmental performance by switching to less polluting fuels or to low carbon electricity, or by improving the efficiency of operations and the technologies used. And let's not forget, alongside emissions, there are other well-documented issues with the social and environmental performance of some mining operations, such as impacts on water quality or inadequate attention to worker safety, or abuses such as child labor in small-scale mining operations. And there's growing scrutiny of these supply chains and rising pressure on manufacturers of clean energy technologies to source only those minerals that have been produced to high standards. And if these standards do not rise across the board, and manufacturers are competing for a small pool of responsibly produced minerals, that could quickly create additional market strains. So to conclude, the rising importance of critical minerals in a fast-changing energy world requires energy policymakers to expand their horizons, consider potential new vulnerabilities and their responses. So I'm going to conclude this presentation with the call to action that the Executive Director referred to, are 6 key recommendations that draw on the IEA's leadership in energy security, as well as the examples of different national and international initiatives in this area. And the first key point is about investment, ensuring adequate investment in diversified sources of supply. As we've mentioned, early and clear signals from policymakers are critical in this respect. But I think, as everyone who's familiar with the energy security debate knows, security of supply also lies in diversity of supply. And in that context, resource-owning governments can support new project developments by reinforcing national geological surveys, streamlining permitting processes, providing financing support to de-risk projects, and also by raising public awareness of the contribution that such projects play in the transformation of our energy sector. But one of the things that the IEA has learned, certainly over its long experience with energy security, is that you cannot have a comprehensive approach that focuses only on the supply side. So it's vital for governments also to step up support for technology innovation, which can alleviate strains on supply by reducing mineral intensities and opening up possibilities for substitution. Just to provide one example, 40 to 50% reductions in the use of silver and silicon in solar cells over the past decade have been critical to enable the spectacular rise that we've seen in solar PV deployment. A third area that is set to become much more important in future is recycling. Now, recycling is quite well established for bulk metals such as steel, aluminium, copper, but that's not yet the case for others such as lithium and rare earth elements. And that will have to change as the amount of spent EV batteries reaching the end of their first life surges after 2030. And the opportunities there are largest in countries that have seen sizable early deployment of the related technologies. Recycling these volumes won't eliminate the need for continued investment in new supplies, but we estimate that by 2040, recycled quantities of copper, lithium, nickel, and cobalt from spent batteries could reduce combined primary supply requirements for these minerals by about 10%. Our fourth area encompasses measures to increase the resilience of supply chains and improve market transparency. As we know from our existing emergency response programs here at IEA, regular market assessments, good data, periodic stress tests, they can all help policymakers identify possible weak points, evaluate potential impacts, and devise the necessary responses. And strategic stockpiling can, in some cases, also help countries weather short-term supply issues. And as we mentioned, the world also needs to step up its efforts to tackle the environmental and social impacts of mineral developments, including emissions, local pollution, treatments of worker safety and welfare. So solutions to climate change cannot work on the back of injustices or poor environmental performance further up the value chain. And suppliers have to do their due diligence to identify, assess, and mitigate these risks. And finally, we need to strengthen international collaboration between producers and consumers. An overarching international framework for dialogue and policy coordination can play a vital role. And in our view, these 6 pillars can provide the basis for a new approach to mineral security. There are huge opportunities here if governments can act and act together. And for our part, the IEA is determined to play a leading role in helping governments around the world to anticipate and navigate possible vulnerabilities and avoid damaging outcomes for our economies and our planet. With that, thank you very much indeed, and we'll move, I think, to your question.
Many thanks, Tim, for the presentation. Yes, so we're moving to the Q&A part of the presentation. We will take a 1-minute break while we compile your questions. Again, please send the questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will be right back. Thank you. Welcome back. We're going to take 3 questions that we have received, and I will ask our participants here to answer them. The first question I will address to Tim Gold from Catherine Howers from AFP. The IEA is recommending a strengthened collaboration between consumers and producers. Do you see any move going that way coming from governments, and how could international collaboration get organized? The second question we received from Kin Imanashi from the Energy Journal of Japan for Taeyun. What policies are necessary to scale up recycling for mineral intensive systems? And we'll take a third question from Sisi Belomo from Il Sole 24 Ore to Dr. Birol. Is the IEA considering a coordination of efforts to build a strategic stockpile of critical minerals similar to the one created for oil? Tim, can I please turn to you for the question from the AFP?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jed, and thanks very much for the question. Yeah, certainly there are initiatives that we're aware of. There are members of the IEA family that have put together a number of initiatives in this respect, and they deal with individual aspects of the areas we've highlighted. Some of them looking at responsible sourcing and production, others looking at more investment-related topics. However, we do feel that there is scope for additional efforts, complementary efforts, and that's very much what we are examining together with our member countries and members of the IEA family. And I think there, as the executive director mentioned, we can draw upon our long-standing experience of these kinds of dialogues amongst different participants in the value chain, all the way from producers to consumers. And indeed, we have wide-ranging experience of these kinds of dialogues, both in relation to fuels, but also in relation to other energy security issues, notably in the electricity sector. So I think that is a discussion that, as was mentioned, we will be continuing over the next days and weeks to see how we can contribute to the sorts of actions that we think are necessary to mitigate the risks that we've highlighted.
Thank you, Tim. I'll turn to Taeyun now, Taeyun Kim, for the question on scaling up recycling for mineral-intensive systems.
Yeah, I think the recycling can play a big role in reducing the burden for primary supply requirement. So it can be one major part of the solution to tackle the mineral security issues. And the most important thing is to achieve the economies of scale to make the recycling commercially viable. And for that, policymakers can encourage efficient sorting and collection process to achieve economies of scale. But there's also role for producers. So producers can make more product design more recycling friendly, and policymakers can facilitate that process for companies to take into account this recycling perspective in their product designs. And the third one is to harmonize regulations across the different regions, because each region has their own recycling regulations and practices. So, but companies work globally, and products and recycled materials move globally. So there's some scope for international collaboration to harmonize these different regulations on recycling.
Thank you very much, Taeyun. I think the colleagues were not able to see Taeyun for technical reasons, but he is here. He is a real man, and he is a real leader of this report. Thank you very much, Taeyun, for your great work in the last several months, working with several parts of the International Energy Agency offices and also with the colleagues around the world. Now, the question from Il Sole 24, whether or not we are considering to build stockpiles for critical minerals like oil. We have been receiving this question in the last few days and weeks regularly. So our answer is we, as the Secretariat, we do not have a plan to do so. It is all when we go for such a major initiative, it will be a decision of our governments to ask us to do so. Having said that, looking at from a based on the numbers and findings of the study we are presenting you today, it is for me not a bad idea if some countries would build, let's say, voluntary strategic stocks, which can be helpful, especially for some of the critical minerals who are highly concentrated on a very few number of suppliers, and there is a low market transparency in terms of the production processes there. So this is not for all the critical minerals, but some of them countries may well think of going in the direction that we have been experiencing in other fields. And once again, when we finish this event, I wanted to underline that the main reason we carried out this study is to make sure that the clean energy transitions will be smoother, less costly, and our chances to reach our climate goals will be higher by addressing one of the barriers we see in front of us, namely the critical minerals. You will see that the International Energy Agency will continue to keep a close eye on critical minerals issue in terms of the stress tests, market assessments, among other things. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Birol. And this concludes our presentation, our Q&A session. I'd like to thank our Executive Director, Tim Gould and Tae-Yoon Kim, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending. The next items on our calendar will be in 2 weeks, where we're releasing our net zero by 2050 roadmap for the global energy sector. We invite you all to join us for that press conference on the 18th of May. Thank you very much.